What if Germany had focused all its military might exclusively against the Soviet Union, avoiding conflict with the Western powers? What if the Wehrmacht's full strength had been unleashed in a singular, apocalyptic crusade eastward? The question isn't merely academic. It represents one of history's most tantalizing alternate realities. A scenario where Adolf Hitler's ideological obsession with Lebensraum and the destruction of Bolshevism became not just the primary objective, but the only objective. To understand this counterfactual, we must first grasp what Hitler actually wanted. The war against the Soviet Union wasn't incidental to Nazi ideology. It was the core, the beating heart of everything the Third Reich stood for. Hitler's hatred of communism, his racist theories about Slavic peoples, his hunger for Eastern territories, these weren't secondary concerns. They were the reason the Nazi state existed at all. In our timeline, Germany's resources were catastrophically divided. The Battle of Britain drained the Luftwaffe. The North African campaign scattered precious armored divisions across desert wastes. The Atlantic Wall consumed millions of tons of concrete and steel. The occupation of Western Europe tied down entire army groups. By the time Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, Germany was already fighting on multiple fronts. Its industrial capacity stretched thin, its strategic focus fragmented. But what if none of that had happened? What if Hitler had pursued a radically different diplomatic strategy? One that kept Britain neutral, avoided antagonizing the United States, and concentrated every available division, every tank, every aircraft, every ton of fuel and ammunition on a single objective: the complete annihilation of the Soviet Union. The plausibility of this scenario rests on a crucial historical moment: the period between September 1939 and June 1941. After the conquest of Poland, Hitler briefly controlled Western Europe's destiny. France had fallen. Britain stood alone, bloodied but unbroken. Churchill's government refused peace, but Britain's capacity to threaten Germany directly was limited. The real question is whether Hitler could have resisted his own megalomaniacal impulses long enough to maintain a cold peace with Britain while preparing for the Eastern Campaign. This would have required a level of strategic discipline Hitler rarely demonstrated. But it wasn't impossible. Consider the alternative sequence of events. In this timeline, Hitler offers Britain a genuine peace settlement in late 1940. The terms are stark but rational from a realpolitik perspective. Germany dominates continental Europe, but the British Empire remains intact. No invasion of Britain, no Battle of Britain, no bombing of London. Churchill would have faced enormous pressure to accept. The British public was exhausted, the empire was financially ruined, American aid hadn't yet materialized in meaningful quantities. A negotiated peace, however bitter, might have seemed preferable to continued bloodshed with no clear path to victory. With Britain neutralized diplomatically, Hitler turns his full attention eastward. The implications are staggering. In our timeline, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with approximately 3.8 million men, 3,350 tanks, and 2,770 aircraft committed to Operation Barbarossa. But this number represented only a portion of Germany's total military strength. Entire divisions remained in France, Norway, the Balkans, and North Africa. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet sat largely idle after the Bismarck disaster. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were scattered across occupied territories. Now imagine all of that redirected. Every Panzer division, every Stuka squadron, every 88mm gun, every liter of fuel. The invasion force could easily have exceeded 5 million men, perhaps even 6 million, with corresponding increases in armor, artillery, and air support. The psychological impact on Stalin would have been profound. Soviet intelligence was already struggling to assess German intentions in early 1941. Stalin famously ignored warnings about the impending invasion, convinced that Hitler wouldn't be foolish enough to fight a two-front war. But in this scenario, there is no two-front war. Germany's diplomatic position is secure. Its western flank is protected not by occupation, but by treaty. The invasion, when it comes, carries the full weight of Germany's industrial and military capacity. Stalin would have faced not just a massive assault, but an existential threat of unprecedented scale. The operational differences would have manifested immediately. In our timeline, Barbarossa nearly succeeded despite Germany's divided focus. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners. But critical shortages emerged quickly. Fuel supplies ran low. Tank production couldn't replace losses. The Luftwaffe struggled to maintain air superiority across the vast Eastern Front. Winter equipment never arrived in sufficient quantities because German logistics were overwhelmed supporting multiple theaters simultaneously. Now remove those constraints. German industry, no longer building U-boats for the Atlantic or fortifications for the Atlantic Wall, pours everything into Eastern Front logistics. Tank production doubles. Fuel reserves triple. Winter uniforms actually reach frontline units before November. The strategic calculus shifts dramatically. In our timeline, Hitler's decision to divert Army Group Center toward Kyiv in August 1941 was influenced partly by concerns about his flanks and partly by the need to secure Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources quickly. With overwhelming force, these concerns diminish. The Wehrmacht could potentially maintain simultaneous pressure on multiple axes, toward Moscow, Leningrad, and the Caucasus, without the operational pauses that gave the Soviets critical time to reorganize and evacuate industry eastward. But here's where the scenario becomes truly dark. A Germany fighting only the Soviet Union isn't just militarily stronger, it's ideologically unrestrained. The Holocaust accelerated in territories where German control was absolute and outside observation was minimal. The Eastern territories, in Nazi ideology, were spaces of colonial conquest, where Slavic populations would be enslaved, starved, or exterminated to make room for German settlers. Without the moderating pressure of international scrutiny, however limited that was even in our timeline, the genocidal nature of the Eastern campaign would have intensified beyond even the horrifying reality we know. The Einsatzgruppen would have operated with even greater impunity. The starvation policies would have been more systematically implemented. The Hunger Plan, which called for the deliberate starvation of tens of millions of Soviet citizens, might have been executed in full. The Soviet Union's capacity to resist would have been tested in ways that strain comprehension. In our timeline, the Red Army's survival during 1941 depended on several factors that would have been critically undermined in this scenario. First, the Soviets managed to evacuate approximately 1,500 factories eastward beyond the Urals, a Herculean feat of industrial relocation that preserved the USSR's war-making capacity. But this evacuation required time, and time was purchased with blood. Every week the Wehrmacht was delayed by logistical bottlenecks, by fierce Soviet resistance, by Hitler's strategic indecision, was another week for trains to carry machinery, workers, and resources into the Siberian depths. With a vastly larger, better supplied German force maintaining relentless pressure across the entire front, this evacuation becomes exponentially more difficult. Consider the siege of Leningrad. In our timeline, the city held out for 872 days, one of history's longest and most brutal sieges. Over 1 million civilians died, mostly from starvation. But Leningrad held, tying down German forces and serving as a symbol of Soviet resistance. In this alternate scenario, Army Group North wouldn't be the understrength force it became. Additional divisions, artillery, and air support could have enabled a direct assault on the city rather than a prolonged siege. The psychological impact of Leningrad's fall, Lenin's city, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, would have been devastating for Soviet morale. Stalin's legitimacy as a wartime leader rested partly on his ability to prevent the complete collapse of resistance. The loss of Leningrad, combined with other catastrophic defeats, might have triggered internal political crisis within the Soviet leadership. Moscow represents an even more critical what-if. Operation Typhoon, the assault on the Soviet capital, began in October 1941. German advance units reached the outskirts of Moscow. Some reconnaissance elements got close enough to see the Kremlin spires through binoculars. But they couldn't break through. Soviet reinforcements, including fresh divisions from Siberia, arrived at the crucial moment. The Wehrmacht, exhausted and under-equipped for winter warfare, was pushed back in December 1941, Germany's first major defeat. This moment was pivotal. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It proved the Red Army could not only survive but counterattack. It bought the Soviets another year to rebuild their forces. In our alternate scenario, Moscow likely falls. The mathematics are brutal but simple. With perhaps 30–40% more combat power available, with better logistics, with winter equipment actually reaching the troops, the Wehrmacht punches through the final defensive lines. The symbolism is apocalyptic. Moscow isn't just the Soviet capital, it's the nerve center of Stalin's entire system. The Communist Party apparatus, the NKVD headquarters, the central command structure of the Red Army, all concentrated in one city. Its capture would represent not just a military victory, but a political and psychological decapitation. Stalin himself would face a terrible choice: remain and risk capture or death, or flee eastward and risk being seen as a coward who abandoned the capital. The question of Stalin's personal fate becomes central to this scenario. Stalin was not Hitler. He was more pragmatic, more ruthless, and in some ways more rational about military realities. If Moscow fell in late 1941 or early 1942, Stalin might not have fled to Kuibyshev or beyond the Urals as the government did briefly in October 1941. He might have calculated that his personal presence, even in a collapsing capital, was necessary to prevent total disintegration. Or, conversely, he might have ordered a fighting retreat eastward, establishing a government in exile in Sverdlovsk or Novosibirsk, determined to continue resistance from the Urals with whatever forces remained. But there's a darker possibility: internal collapse. The Soviet system was held together partly by terror, partly by ideology, and partly by military success. A series of catastrophic defeats might have prompted elements within the Communist Party or the military to consider a coup. Beria, Molotov, or even Zhukov might have concluded that Stalin's continued leadership guaranteed destruction. The Germans, for their part, would have faced their own crisis, not of defeat, but of victory. Nazi planning for the occupation of Soviet territories was shockingly haphazard and contradictory. Different agencies, the Wehrmacht, the SS, the civilian administration under Alfred Rosenberg, Goering's economic apparatus, all had competing visions for how conquered Soviet territories should be exploited. The Generalplan Ost, the master plan for Eastern colonization, called for the eventual deportation or extermination of 80–85% of the Polish population, 75% of Belarusians, and 65% of Ukrainians to make room for German settlers. This wasn't theoretical, it was official policy, discussed in planning documents, budgeted for, scheduled for implementation. With Germany controlling vast swaths of Soviet territory more completely than in our timeline, potentially everything west of the Urals by 1942 or 1943, the implementation of these genocidal policies would have begun in earnest. The Holocaust, remember, killed approximately 6 million Jews. But Nazi racial ideology targeted many more groups: Slavs, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, homosexuals. The death toll in the occupied Soviet territories was already staggering. Somewhere between 8 to 10 million Soviet civilians died during the war from direct violence, starvation, and disease caused by German occupation policies. In this scenario, with German control more complete and prolonged, those numbers could easily have doubled or tripled. The economic dimension deserves scrutiny. Germany's war economy was always precarious, dependent on conquered resources and slave labor. Ukraine's grain, the Caucasus oil fields, the industrial centers of the Donbass, these were strategic objectives as important as any city. In our timeline, the Soviets implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying infrastructure as they retreated. But with faster German advances and less time for systematic destruction, the Germans would have captured more intact facilities. The psychological calculus for Soviet forces would have been agonizing. Destroy your own country's infrastructure to deny it to the enemy, or preserve it hoping for eventual liberation. Yet even with these advantages, Germany would have faced insurmountable problems beyond the Urals. The Soviet Union's vast geography, which saved it in our timeline, would remain a factor. The Trans-Siberian Railway stretches over 9,000 kilometers.
Soviet factories relocated to cities like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Novosibirsk were physically unreachable by German ground forces without an even longer supply line across terrain that became increasingly difficult. The Wehrmacht's logistics, impressive by 1940 standards, were still dependent on railroads, horses, and trucks. The gauge of Soviet railways differed from European railways, requiring constant conversion of captured track or transshipment of supplies. Every kilometer deeper into Russia multiplied these problems exponentially.
The question of what the Western powers would do in this scenario introduces variables that range from plausible to deeply unsettling. Britain, having made peace with Germany in 1940, would be watching the Eastern carnage with mounting horror and strategic calculation. Churchill, if still in power, though a negotiated peace might well have ended his premiership, would have understood the implications immediately. A German victory over the Soviet Union wouldn't create a stable peace. It would create a continental superpower controlling resources from the Atlantic to the Urals, a nightmare scenario for British strategic interests that made even Nazi Germany in our timeline look modest by comparison. The United States presents an even more complex calculation. In our timeline, America's entry into the European war came through a circuitous route. German submarine warfare threatened American shipping, Hitler's declaration of war after Pearl Harbor formally brought the U.S. into the European theater, and the moral imperative of stopping fascism eventually galvanized public opinion. But in this alternate scenario, with no Battle of Britain, no North African campaign, no immediate threat to American interests, isolationist sentiment in the United States would have remained powerful through 1941 and possibly beyond. The America First Committee was enormously influential, and figures like Charles Lindbergh commanded significant public support for staying out of European conflicts. Yet Roosevelt understood the stakes. He had been maneuvering for months before Pearl Harbor to support Britain despite official neutrality, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, Lend-Lease, increasingly aggressive naval patrols in the Atlantic. The question is whether FDR could have convinced the American public to support intervention on behalf of the Soviet Union, a communist state that most Americans viewed with deep suspicion, against Germany, a country with which America was technically at peace. The moral argument becomes murkier, the strategic threat less immediate, the isolationist counter-argument more persuasive. It's entirely possible that America sits out the European conflict entirely until the Pacific War forces its hand, and even then, that war might remain confined to the Pacific theater. This leads to the darkest iteration of the scenario: a German victory over the Soviet Union accomplished without triggering American intervention. By late 1942 or early 1943, German forces have pushed Soviet remnants beyond the Urals or forced a negotiated surrender. Stalin is either dead, captured, or ruling a rump state from Siberia with no realistic prospect of recovery. The Third Reich now controls the largest land empire in history, stretching from France to the Volga, from Norway to the Caucasus. The population under Nazi control exceeds 400 million people. The economic resources dwarf anything achieved by previous empires. What happens next depends entirely on whether Hitler lives and maintains control. In our timeline, Hitler's health deteriorated significantly after 1943, the result of stress, poor diet, and the cocktail of drugs his physician Theodore Morell administered daily. He suffered from tremors, possibly Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular problems, and likely suffered minor strokes. By 1945, he was a physical wreck. But in this timeline, without the existential stress of losing the war, with the euphoria of seemingly impossible victory, Hitler might survive longer, or might not. The Nazi leadership was riven with rivalries. Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, Bormann, Speer, each commanding different power bases, each ambitious, each ruthless. If Hitler dies or becomes incapacitated in, say, 1944 or 1945, what comes next? A succession crisis in a totalitarian state is always bloody, but in a Nazi Reich controlling half of Europe and Western Russia, it could be apocalyptic. Himmler, controlling the SS and the security apparatus, would be well positioned, but Goering held the title of Hitler's designated successor, commanded the Luftwaffe, and retained significant popularity. The Wehrmacht generals, never fully reconciled to Nazi control, might see an opportunity. The result could be anything from a relatively smooth transition to an SS dictatorship to outright civil war between competing factions with nuclear weapons. Because yes, we need to talk about that. In our timeline, Germany's nuclear program lagged far behind the Manhattan Project, partly due to the loss of Jewish scientists who fled the Reich, partly due to resource constraints, partly due to strategic miscalculations about the weapon's feasibility. But in a timeline where Germany isn't fighting in multiple theaters, where resources aren't stretched desperately thin, where the scientific establishment has more access to funding and materials, the atomic bomb becomes a more realistic possibility. Germany had brilliant physicists, Heisenberg, von Weizsäcker, Hahn. They understood the principles. With a few different decisions, a bit more funding, and, crucially, a few more years of peace after defeating the Soviet Union, Germany could conceivably have developed nuclear weapons by the late 1940s. A Nazi Germany with atomic weapons and control of Eurasia represents a scenario so nightmarish that it almost defies analysis. The Holocaust could be prosecuted not over years, but over decades, with industrial efficiency applied to genocide on a scale that makes even the actual Holocaust seem like a preview. The surviving populations of Eastern Europe and Western Russia would live under a regime that viewed them as subhuman, useful only for slave labor until German settlers could replace them. The German vision for these territories wasn't just conquest, it was demographic replacement, cultural erasure, a reshaping of the ethnic map of Europe that would take generations. Britain, isolated and facing a nuclear-armed continental superpower, would be in an impossible position. The Royal Navy and the English Channel offer some protection, but against atomic weapons, these traditional defenses become far less meaningful. The British Empire, already crumbling economically, would face pressure to accommodate German power. Perhaps a genuine understanding is reached. Germany dominates Europe, Britain retains its overseas empire, and an uneasy coexistence emerges. Or perhaps Germany, emboldened by total victory in the East, eventually turns westward again, and Britain faces a second existential crisis without allies and without hope. The United States, meanwhile, would be developing its own nuclear arsenal. The Manhattan Project was motivated by fear of German atomic weapons. Ironically, in our timeline, Germany was never close to building the bomb, but American scientists didn't know that. In this alternate timeline, the fear would be justified. By the late 1940s, you could have two nuclear-armed superpowers, Nazi Germany controlling Eurasia and the United States dominating the Western Hemisphere and possibly the Pacific. The Cold War would still occur, but it would be between fascism and democracy rather than communism and capitalism. The ideological stakes would be even starker, the moral clarity more absolute, and the danger of nuclear confrontation equally present. But there's another possibility that historians and alternate history enthusiasts often overlook: collapse from within. Empires don't just fall to external enemies, they collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The Nazi system was breathtakingly inefficient, overlapping bureaucracies, competing power centers, ideologically driven decisions that made no economic sense, endemic corruption, and leadership selected more for loyalty than competence. The Germans proved brilliant at conquering territory, but terrible at administering it sustainably. In our timeline, the occupation of the Soviet Union was characterized by brutal exploitation, resistance movements, partisan warfare, and catastrophic mismanagement. These problems don't disappear with a more complete conquest, they intensify. Imagine trying to hold down a territory stretching thousands of kilometers, populated by tens of millions of hostile inhabitants, with resistance movements supplied, perhaps covertly by Britain or America, with infrastructure constantly sabotaged, with garrison troops slowly demoralized by the impossibility of their task. The Germans would need millions of soldiers just for occupation duty. The economic exploitation that was supposed to benefit the Reich would be constantly disrupted. The ideological project of Germanization would proceed, but slowly, bloodily, and with diminishing returns, as each new act of repression created more enemies. The generational question becomes critical. Hitler's generation, the men who fought in World War I, who joined the Nazi Party in the 1920s, who believed fanatically in the cause, would eventually age out. What comes next? Germans born in the 1940s and 1950s, raised in a victorious Reich, educated in Nazi schools, would they maintain the same ideological fervor? Or would some begin to question the endless occupation, the constant military deployments, the economic costs of empire? History suggests that even the most totalitarian systems face generational change, and each generation tends to be less committed to the founding mythology than the last. The final question, perhaps the most haunting, is whether this nightmare scenario could have been permanent, or whether the internal contradictions of Nazi ideology would have eventually torn the system apart from within. History offers few examples of totalitarian regimes maintaining absolute control for more than a few generations. The Soviet Union, despite its repressive apparatus, eventually decayed and collapsed. The question is whether Nazi Germany, even in total victory, could have avoided a similar fate, or whether victory itself would have accelerated the regime's internal dissolution. The economic model deserves careful examination. Nazi Germany's economy was essentially a war economy, geared toward conquest and plunder rather than sustainable growth. The regime survived the 1930s partly through massive deficit spending on rearmament, partly through confiscation of Jewish property, and partly through the resources gained from Austria and Czechoslovakia. The conquests of 1939–1941 brought more resources, but also more mouths to feed and more territory to control. In this alternate timeline, victory over the Soviet Union would bring immense resources, oil, grain, minerals, industrial capacity, but only if those resources could be effectively extracted and transported. Given the Germans' demonstrated incompetence at colonial administration, this is far from guaranteed. The slave labor system that underpinned the German economy was both morally abhorrent and economically inefficient. Slaves work slowly, sabotage equipment, produce poor quality goods, and require constant supervision. The SS built a network of concentration camps partly for ideological reasons, the extermination of enemies, but also to provide labor for German industry. By 1944, concentration camp labor was essential to German war production. In our alternate scenario, with tens of millions of Soviets reduced to slave status, this system would expand exponentially. But slavery, throughout history, has never produced sustained economic growth. It enriches elites in the short term, but creates long-term stagnation because it removes incentives for innovation, technological advancement, and efficient production. The demographic catastrophe would extend beyond the Holocaust and the targeted populations. Germany itself would face severe population strain. Garrison troops scattered across an empire stretching thousands of kilometers, administrative personnel managing conquered territories, settlers encouraged to relocate eastward, all of this would deplete the German homeland of working-age men. The Nazi ideology celebrated motherhood and encouraged German women to have large families, but it also excluded women from most professional roles and higher education. The demographic math simply doesn't work for sustaining empire over multiple generations without massive immigration, which Nazi racial ideology explicitly forbade. Technology introduces another variable. In our timeline, the post-war era saw explosive technological advancement: computers, jet aircraft, space exploration, nuclear power, telecommunications, eventually the internet. Much of this was driven by competition between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. In an alternate timeline where Nazi Germany dominates Eurasia, does that technological progress still happen? The Nazi regime was hostile to Jewish physics, relativity theory, promoted pseudo-scientific racial theories, and made decisions based on ideology rather than empirical evidence. A regime that burns books, persecutes intellectuals, and values racial purity over merit is not positioned to lead technological innovation. The American counterweight becomes crucial. The United States, even without entering a European war, would continue its own technological development. The post-war American economy, in our timeline, was an engine of innovation partly because it absorbed European refugees, including scientists fleeing fascism. In this alternate scenario, those refugees would flee to America in even greater numbers.
The brain drain from occupied Europe would be catastrophic for Germany and enormously beneficial for the United States. By the 1950s and 60s, you could see a widening technological gap. America advancing rapidly in electronics, aerospace, computing, and nuclear technology, while Nazi Germany stagnates under an ideologically rigid system that stifles innovation. This creates a long-term strategic vulnerability. Even if Germany achieves nuclear weapons, the technological base required to maintain and advance those weapons requires sustained scientific innovation. The United States, with its universities, research institutions, and culture of relatively open scientific inquiry, would be better positioned for long-term competition. By the 1960s or 70s, America might possess superior nuclear weapons, delivery systems, missile defense, and other technologies that would shift the balance of power despite Germany's territorial control. The satellite states and occupied territories would be sources of constant instability. In our timeline, Soviet control of Eastern Europe was challenged repeatedly: the East German Uprising of 1953, the Hungarian Revolution of 1968, the Prague Spring of 19 Solidarity in Poland in the 1980s. Each time, Soviet tanks crushed the resistance, but each uprising demonstrated the fragility of imposed rule. Nazi control of Eastern Europe and Western Russia would face similar challenges, but likely more violent, because Nazi occupation was more brutal and more explicitly genocidal than even Soviet occupation. Resistance movements would never fully die out. Some would receive covert support from Britain or America. Others would be driven by nationalism, religion, or simple survival instinct. The Germans would find themselves fighting an endless counterinsurgency across multiple fronts, decade after decade, with no clear end state. The generational shift within Germany itself might prove decisive. The Germans who lived through the war, who experienced the victories, who believed in the cause, they would eventually die. Their children and grandchildren, born into a victorious Reich, might take that victory for granted. They would grow up in a society where millions of soldiers were permanently deployed abroad, where the economy was burdened by empire, where the promised prosperity of conquest never fully materialized because occupation costs consumed the plunder. Historical patterns suggest that imperial fatigue sets in, that distant wars become unpopular, that populations tire of sacrifice for abstract ideological goals. The scenario's ultimate resolution might come not through military defeat, but through internal transformation or collapse. Perhaps a post-Hitler leadership facing economic stagnation, endless insurgencies, and technological inferiority to America begins a slow process of retrenchment. Perhaps they maintain control of core territories, Germany, Austria, Poland, Western Russia, but gradually withdraw from more distant conquests because they're unsustainable. Perhaps a reform faction emerges within the Nazi Party, arguing for a less genocidal, more pragmatic approach to governing conquered peoples, not out of moral awakening, but cold calculation that the current system isn't working. Or perhaps the collapse is sudden and violent. A succession crisis after Hitler's death spirals into civil war between SS and Wehrmacht factions. Occupied populations seize the moment to revolt simultaneously, coordinated perhaps by covert American or British intelligence support. The empire fragments into competing statelets, warlord territories, and restored nations. The genocide finally ends, not because the Nazis develop a conscience, but because they lose the capacity to continue it. The demographic catastrophe would already be complete. Tens of millions dead, cultures erased, languages lost, entire ethnic groups reduced to scattered survivors. The moral weight of this scenario is almost unbearable to contemplate. In our timeline, the Holocaust and Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe killed approximately 17 million civilians. The war's total death toll exceeded 70 million. These numbers are so vast they become almost abstract, but each number represents an individual human life, someone's child, parent, sibling, friend. In this alternate scenario, where German control was more complete and prolonged, where the genocidal policies were implemented more thoroughly, the death toll could easily have doubled. Perhaps 150 million dead, perhaps more. The phrase crimes against humanity fails to capture the magnitude. Yet this scenario also demonstrates something crucial about our actual history. How close we came to exactly this outcome. In the summer of 1941, German victory over the Soviet Union looked not just possible, but probable to most observers. The Red Army was reeling. Moscow seemed doomed. If a few variables had been different, if Stalin had been killed or captured, if winter had come a few weeks later, if German logistics had been slightly better, this nightmare could have been our reality. We live in the timeline where the Soviet Union survived, D-Day succeeded, Hitler committed suicide in a Berlin bunker, and the Third Reich collapsed. But it was contingent. It required millions of individual acts of courage, sacrifice, and resistance. It required Stalin's ruthlessness and Roosevelt's support and Churchill's defiance and Zhukov's military genius and countless Soviet soldiers fighting to the death and partisan resistance and intelligence work and industrial mobilization and, yes, luck. The counterfactual reminds us that history is not inevitable. The forces arrayed against Nazi Germany, the Allies' industrial capacity, Soviet manpower, American resources, British intelligence, these advantages existed but had to be mobilized, coordinated, and applied effectively.